let's begin with the genesis of this investigation. I mean, in a shocking murder case such as this one, what were some of the initial challenges that police faced when they first arrived at the crime scene?
You know, the thing about this case is that it initially, the received wisdom was that it was going to be somebody that had been in the house. It was a little bit of a party house. You have these three young, attractive college girls. And so I think the received wisdom on the part of a lot of people, including observers like myself, is, all right, where's the boyfriend? You know, where's the love triangle? You know, you're looking at something like that because it became clear pretty quickly that there wasn't like a burglary motive or something like that. Now, they did a good job from everything I hear and see relative to preserving the crime scene. Patrol showed up after they were finally called, and they preserved it, and they got in there and they did what they did with relative to the crime scene. So initial challenges, I would say, first of all, is the fact that it wasn't called in right away. As you know, it was an overnight. But that said, it does look like they did a good job preserving the crime scene because they got that DNA. But then the subsequent challenge early in the case was the fact that it was, as I was saying, a stranger murder. You know what I mean? And those are always the toughest. That's why serial killers can be very difficult, because they don't necessarily track specifically to a person. They're just out there looking for a random type. And so that makes it difficult. Plus, they move around and everything else. So in this case, you had a guy who didn't have very concrete connections at all to the four victims. And I think that in terms of the detective catching the case, once you start washing out everybody's boyfriend, associates, and so on and so forth, and you're not really coming down quickly on the fact that, okay, here's a guy that had a gripe, knew them, history of violence, that kind of thing. Now you're looking at a blank slate, and you have to go the digital forensic route, which is one of the things that I was harping on when Fox had sent me out there in the immediate aftermath. I was saying things like, look, since they seem to be saying it's not any of the boyfriends, and they're really starting from from the get-go here, looking at everybody and anybody, I really felt like it was going to come down to digital forensics, and ultimately you could argue that in a lot of ways it did.
So in terms of that night, or really, as you said, that day, later in the day, what do we know about the initial evidence that was collected from the crime scene? And then how did that shape how the rest of the investigation unfolded?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's not entirely clear still how much stuff they got day of when they went there later in the day after they were finally called, 5-6 hours after the initial event. But we do know certain things, and we know the things that matter. And the DNA, I think, is the real key in terms of what they got. Because, a lot of people don't, I think, realize that the case was proceeding along, I would say, two tracks. The first of them was the video and cell phone evidence that they were pursuing relative to the fact that one of the roommates, as we know now well, Dylan, saw the perp, Bryan Kohberger, but he had a balaclava on, so she only could see his eyes, but she gave a pretty good description: height, weight, build, and then those notorious bushy eyebrows. So there was that track. Separately, they were pursuing the touch DNA, which is really minuscule, and that's why I say they did a good job processing the scene, safeguarding the scene. This is an enormously bloody scene. The detectives have been quoted as saying the worst scene they'd ever seen, and of course it would be, and considering the magnitude of what occurred. And yet, they got that touch DNA. So, more power to them. They did a great job. So anyway, they're going on two different tracks, and a lot of people felt like a vulnerability in the case, and that could be why the prosecution was willing to take the plea deal, was because of the DNA methodology, the genetic genealogy, which I'm sure we can talk about. But what I've always argued is they were proceeding towards Bryan Kohberger irrespective of that, because they had dumped the cell towers. They had gotten the video of the car with the missing front plate, and the campus cops in Washington had already put a finger on Kohberger and said, hey, we have a car that matches that description, and they called the lead in to the task force over in Moscow. Now, the reason that matters is because if you look at that car and you do any digging on it, as the detectives in Moscow, you're going to say, okay, let me see the owner of that car, which the campus police would have certainly have done, all right? They would have pulled the student ID photo of him, right? Or they could have got it from the DMV and send it over. And you got a guy that matches the description that Dylan gave in terms of body, weight, height, and the bushy eyebrows. So you're halfway home already there. Then you look at his car, and you say, okay, the car matches what we have here. Now, the car in the video that the woman from the gas station called in was missing the front plate. You look at Kohberger's car. Well, it's not missing the front plate. Let's do just a quick check on this car. Oh, he just re-registered the car here in Washington State, and he went from one plate to two, because in Pennsylvania, you're only required to have the one plate. Those are the kind of atmospherics where you start to say to yourself, I think we got our guy. So they were there. The timeline's a little squishy. I don't think anybody knows but the detectives in the case. But they were very close, and I can sort of prove it, demonstrate it, by the fact that when the DNA was challenged in the original jurisdiction in Moscow, the judge came back and said, I'll allow this challenge to go forward, almost for academic purposes. It was strange. But he said, but I want it to be clear. The probable cause to arrest Bryan Kohberger had nothing to do with the initial DNA search. And so what he was essentially saying is they had him anyway, and he was sort of safeguarding the DNA evidence. He didn't want that to become an issue. Ultimately, it did become an issue in the new venue, and it ended up coming in anyway. But that said, the judge himself said the probable cause did not come from the DNA. And so that tells me that they were right where they needed to be anyway. And, so that's the track that they were going down while they were pursuing the DNA thing. And again, I just go back to what I had said a couple of years ago when this thing broke. I used to say they're going to do all of this stuff. What they're going to do to sort of nail it down is the DNA is going to be sort of the ultimate proof. That's going to be the nail in the coffin where they just say, okay, there's just no way we don't have the right guy here. Because these days, the CSI effect, the juries are conditioned to want science. And so, I think that's the track they went, and, it was the right track.
So you mentioned, Paul, the surveillance footage. So one piece of evidence that garnered a lot of attention was that surveillance footage. So talk to us about how that helped law enforcement narrow down a timeline. And you mentioned the vehicle. Talk to us about the details of narrowing down that vehicle of interest and how that all fit in. Right.
So that was really, really important because it gave them, first of all, where the car was. So you could say to yourself, okay, it's going in that direction. The assumption would be the guy's on his way home, if nothing else. But you now have a visual on a car that, remember, it came out subsequent that they already had the car on video at the location doing that infamous three-point turn and so on and so forth. So you knew the person in that car is our guy. They had some bad luck because the way the video was configured, you couldn't see who was driving. You couldn't even get like a silhouette or anything. But you do have to speak up for an unsung hero here. I just was talking about the two cops from the Pullman campus of Washington University, or Washington State University, I think it's called, because they're the ones who dug out the car. And it's funny, they each did it independent of each other. One of them did it on the computer system at Washington University, and the other guy did it by just flat footwork, got in his car, drove around looking, and came upon it. They both came upon it the same day independent. So it just shows you that was a very sort of salient piece of evidence. But this video that you're talking about is the same thing. The owner of the gas station, or the worker in the gas station, she wasn't the owner. She's doing the overnight shift. And ultimately, after they had put it out to law enforcement, they put it out a couple days later to the general public and say, hey, guys, we have a vehicle of interest. And it was really of interest because, as I said, they knew already that it looks like the same car. It is the same car that was at the location doing the three-point turn. So they knew they're looking for this white car. And the woman in the gas station, it's a dead overnight. She's working 24 hours. She says to herself, you know what? I'll take a shot. Let me look at the external camera of my gas station here to see if it captured anything going back. And it was a long time. It was like a week, 10 days or something. I forget when she did it. But generally, those systems overwrite. And we just got lucky. I think it overwrote every 2 weeks was the plan or something. It just came in under the wire. And she's like, whoa, this looks like the car. And then the timeline matched up. And so she came forward with that. Why was that key? Because it shows you where he was going, the time fit, corroborated the white car. But you could see very clearly in the gas station video that you were missing that front plate. And as I said, if you matched that to what the Washington cops came up with off the campus, and if you did some backgrounding on Kohberger's car, you're going to see Pennsylvania was where he previously had it registered. Pennsylvania only requires a rear plate, which is pretty rare. There's not that many states like that. Most require 2. And then you'd have to say to yourself, that's such like an oddball thing. You got to start to look at him. So, yeah, that video was key. The video from the location was key. The video from the location is interesting because it also apparently picked up audio, which we ultimately saw in the true crime special that was put out on Dateline that caused such hubbub. You actually heard what sounded like Xana's murder, which should not have been leaked beforehand. And, we could talk about where that all went. But, so video ended up being, as everything, these days, very, very, and by the way, that was the only video. I was out there with Lawrence Jones. We were scrubbing the neighborhood, and we couldn't find any cameras. We asked all the locals, nobody had any cameras. Well, that camera had been found right away by the cops. It was the only one. It was a big break. It had audio, and they took the camera. So while we were out there, me and Lawrence were looking around for all the cameras, and we said, I went on the air, and we said, there's no cameras here anywhere. It's too bad. Well, it turns out there was one, and the cops already had taken it.
Yeah. I think what you've just said, just to provide a little color commentary of my own, first on the cameras, this just illustrates what a safe neighborhood everyone thought it was. And these were college kids. And this, it really is a very simple, sort of idyllic existence out there. And then when you talk about the law enforcement officers of WazU, Washington State University, recall that I went to University of Washington across the state. So our rivals were Washington State. So we would go at least once a year, we would go to a football game at WazU. And Moscow, University of Idaho, is just 8 minutes away.
Yeah, it's right there. Yeah.
Right across the border. And this illustrates how everyone there sees it as one community. Yeah. And that the cops at Wazoo are like, it's not separate. We think of things as other states and like separate communities, but it is just one. Right. And, it's friendly rivalries. And a lot of families, they call them divided households. They have one kid that goes to UW, one kid that goes to Wazoo, one kid that goes to University of Idaho, or whatever it is.
Right?
Yeah. And so it's really, it's the Pac Northwest, and especially in that area, everyone, it's one identity there, and it just goes to show that Washington State was deeply invested in solving this too. It wasn't just this isolated University of Idaho campus.
No question.
Moscow and Pullman are really, one big community there.
Wazoo, I never heard that. Yeah, so
I probably say it derogatorily. I think everyone that goes there likes to say Washington State, but we say Wazoo.
Well, it was a beautiful area. I'd never been to that part of the country. It's one of these things where I was out there, and it really came home to me like how sad the whole situation was, because it is an idyllic area. It's beautiful, man. And Moscow itself is this really quaint little town, and then Wazoo, as you say, you go over there and it's bigger, but like it's real like middle America college stuff. They got this big arena where they play the basketball. I went to one of the games while I was out there. So, you can see it, and it's like, God, this animal killed 4 people in the midst of all of this. It's really, really heartbreaking, because you can see how they must have felt very safe, not locked the doors, a little bit of a party house, as we all know, which, we all did that stuff in college. And the proof of that, I think, is the fact that he came in through the rear doors.
Yeah.
It struck me right away when I was out there. Initially, everybody was saying, well, he came in the front because a neighbor had said that I saw the morning after the front door slightly ajar. So everybody was focusing on the front door. And the front door actually looks out onto a field, and across the field was the fraternity house that Ethan belonged to. So there was a lot of focus on the front of the house. When I got out there, whatever it was, the week after the event, when I was walking the area and I walked up behind into the parking lot, there was like a hill, and you come up behind, there's like a parking lot, and then you can look through the trees down this hill, and you're looking into the back door of the house, the second floor where the glass doors are, and where Dylan and Xana had their bedrooms. But you're looking into like the kitchen, the shared kitchen, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks right between the eyes. And I just knew he came in through the back, because you could surveil the house. It's safe. You're guarded by the trees. And all you have to do is you can watch everything that's going on. And we now know that he was almost certainly, for a while, watching that house previously in the weeks and months leading up to it, potentially. But then night of, he pulled up. He must have looked through the house, so there was nobody in the kitchen. The 2 girls, Maddie and Kaylee, had been eating at that kitchen table and then went upstairs because they got food after they were coming back from the bar, the famous food truck. So it just hit me right away. This is where he was. Yeah. And ultimately, that's what he did. And the proof of what you're saying about them feeling so secure is the fact that those glass windows, which you could look in and watch like a fish tank, were not locked. And that was reportedly one of the things that they looked at very hard was there was a handprint on the window. But I don't think I think that washed out. It didn't come back to him. I think if I remember, he was wearing gloves because, he was a criminology student and he knew enough to do that.
So, Paul, you talked about the digital forensics also. You talked about the cell phone pings and the online account history. So how big of a role did all of that play in this investigation? And can you flesh that out for us?
So I think one of the big digital aspects that we know was there, aside from the phone pings that we've talked about, they dumped the cell tower. They see that he had turned off his phone for the period of the murder, but then turned it on again, which was, I thought he thinks he was being clever, but of course he was not, because if you do the history of his phone, which you can get online, even if he threw his phone in the river, but I think they got the phone anyway. But in fact, I know they did because they had photos from the phone. But the fact that he always has his phone on, but then he turns it off for 5 hours around the homicide, and when he left the area, it's just like, guy, are you kidding me? It puts a finger right on you. But then there was also the fact that they could follow his route from when he turned the phone back on, and they matched it to the car. And it shows him driving around the neighborhood in the area, and then it shows him coming back. His phone was already back on at 9:30 in the morning. The next day, he came back to see, I guess, wow, did the cops come yet? He was there before the cops were called. The cops were called, if I recall, about 11 a.m. He came back about 9:30 just to case the house, and nobody had yet called the police. So they had him coming back to the scene of the crime. Well, what a cliche. The other thing that I think from his digital footprint that we know is there, I could speculate because I suspect his computer and or his phone likely hit the social media of all of the girls at some point. That was one of the points I was making initially when it looked like, wow, it's a stranger murder. I was saying just look on the various social media accounts of all of the girls, because my supposition was that it was somebody that was stalking at least one of the girls. That, you'd see whatever identifier, whether it was an IP or some other identifier that you could capture, you would see whichever one hit all of them around the time of the murders. That's your guy. I don't know if they did that. They very well might have. The FBI is very good at this kind of thing. They can write a piece of software. They probably have it already. My guys used to be able to do it in NYPD, but we're a lot bigger than Moscow PD. So, you got the Bureau in it. You're going to need them, or Idaho PD, State PD. But then, of course, there was the Amazon searches. And remember, you didn't have, that was the one piece that was missing here, is you did not have, you didn't have like a witness who saw his face, but you also didn't have the weapon, the murder weapon. So in lieu of the murder weapon, you got to try to make Bryan Kohberger track to a big K-bar knife. And then in the Amazon searches, you see that some months before the event, he had not only bought a K-bar knife, which had a sheath, which matched the sheath that was found at the scene, but then subsequent to the murders, he was again searching around for a similar knife, because presumably he knows he doesn't have the sheath, and he would have gotten rid of the knife wherever he put it, likely in the river or something. They've never found it. And so he was looking for another one. And so they would have been able to demonstrate, and that was challenged by the defense, and the prosecution blew right through it. The judge sided with prosecution. No, his Amazon history is coming in. He's looking for a replacement knife. And what's so chilling about that is, aside from the fact that it would have been great evidence had it gone to trial, it argues that he was going to do it again. It argues that he thought that he had gotten away with it, and who was his next target. And there's one of those situations where I would argue that if the police don't release any further information and further evidence, more power to them. Because what you don't want to do is release the contents of that phone, let's say, and there are a few women that are on there that you could confirm he had been looking at, and now they're going to be looking over the shoulders for the rest of their life. Maybe ignorance is bliss, because you don't want to know that you were on his target list.
So you talked about the touch DNA. Now, investigators found that touch DNA left behind on the knife sheath that was located at the crime scene under Maddie's body or in her bed.
Right.
And the sample didn't have a match in the FBI's National Criminal Database. So how were agents able to narrow down the suspect from that touch DNA?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was going to become, I think, a real contentious aspect had it gone to trial, because it was certainly a contentious aspect of the pretrial motions. Short version is that what they did is now known as genealogical DNA testing, and what it really comes down to is the following. You have a DNA sample, you put it into the CODIS database, it doesn't hit to somebody, all right? Because that database is not that old and not that populated. And there are all kinds of privacy rules that keep you from populating it. It has to be a felony and all sort of stuff that varies state to state. And so, okay, so now you have this DNA sample. What are you going to do with it? Well, you then can ping it through the commercial databases like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, which they did. Here's the problem. And then they didn't get a hit. They didn't get a direct hit. The problem is that those companies don't like law enforcement because it damages their business model. Because if it's commonly known that law enforcement uses those databases to find bad guys, then anybody who's ever done anything wrong or might do anything wrong or is just paranoid doesn't want their sample in there, and so they're not going to go to Ancestry and 23andMe, and it damages their ability to make money. I get it. So that's why they have all these caveats when you sign up to that thing. So what's interesting is that above that level of commercial database, that stuff gets loaded up into a sort of quasi-governmental database that's larger. And so what they did, and when I say they, it's the FBI in this instance, and that's actually a complication, and I'll explain. They took this piece of touch DNA. They must have, I don't know what they did, because I never, myself as the investigator, would have used the one bit I got. So they must have gotten enough that they could preserve some but send some in. My understanding, now this is from sourcing, all right? So I want to be clear that there's something, there's a little, could be a little speculative, but my understanding is what they did is they took the touch DNA, knew that they would get challenged if they sent it in, even with a search warrant. They were going to have a legal rigmarole here. And there was already a lot of eyes on the case. So they posed as clients. They took the DNA and they acted like they were just a client. And they sent it in saying like, hey, do I have any other long-lost relatives out there that I don't know about? And it went up the chain above the commercial database to this quasi-governmental one that I'm talking about, which I've never seen adequately explained how it happens. But apparently the commercial databases upload to this larger database. In the larger database, they got back possibles where they said, okay, client, here's your answer. You could, according to your DNA, be related to, let's call it 15 people. I never got the number. And this is generally how genealogical DNA investigation works. You get possibles. Now you have to do detective work. And that's why it's not a one-to-one correspondence where, hey, we got the DNA back. Here's our guy. If you're lucky it's in a CODIS database, great. But if you don't have that, you have to do what I just described. So now you got 15 possibles, and you got to start to dig in as detectives into those 15 people to see if they track to anything near your crime scene. And ultimately what happened was when they got it back and they started looking at the possibles, one of the possibles was Bryan Kohberger's father. Now, Bryan Kohberger's father lives in Pennsylvania. So he's not an immediate match. It's not like you say, we got this guy in Pennsylvania, that's got to be our guy. You got to say to yourself, well, now we got to do the detective work. It comes back as a possible. There's like a 66% match in the DNA from the scene to this older man in Pennsylvania. He's not our perp, but let's look. And ultimately somebody said, hey, wait a minute. This guy's son is going to school 8 minutes from the crime scene. And that's how they use genealogical DNA investigation in this case and in a general sense to finally get. It takes, as you can see, some real legwork, but ultimately that's how they got to him. It would have been confirmatory, but as I said, I think they would have got him in fact, I know they would have got him anyway, ultimately, but the DNA is just such a slam dunk. And then, of course, what they did was they got the garbage. And when they got the garbage in Pennsylvania, when they had already developed him and they were watching his house, they took DNA from the garbage, they matched it to Kohberger, and it came back again as his father. His father was in the garbage, the DNA. And so they knew, all right, this is definitely our guy. So that's why when they got Kohberger, they had an arrest warrant and a search warrant. And not only did they search the house, the search warrant allowed for a buccal swab, rather the cheek swab. They go in with a Q-tip and swab the inside of your cheek. That gives them, and that was a 1-to-1 match to Kohberger from the scene.
So once he was finally identified as the prime suspect, Kohberger, what more did the authorities need to do before they were able to arrest him? And how long was he surveilled by law enforcement prior to that arrest then?
So that's a great question, because they had developed him as a possible, I think they were getting there before he left town. And I don't know why the following thing didn't happen. And this is a question I would have if I was talking to the investigators, because the timeline, and this is not a criticism, the timeline is not entirely clear to me. It's just a question I have if I could talk to, let's say, the lead detective, who I think was a sergeant from Moscow PD. And he got a lot of criticism. I don't remember the guy's name, but it was like, the guy doesn't have a lot of time on and everything else. Give him their due, man. They nailed this. But in any case, the question I would have is, how'd you let him leave town? Because if he was already developed as a possible, relative to how I described it earlier through the phone pings that we knew that happened on the cell towers, the car, including this great lead that came in from Washington State University 8 minutes away. What I would have done is I would have said, okay, we're sitting on DNA. This guy looks really good. Take his garbage from, in Washington State University. And in fact, I was just out there, and one of the things I did quite purposely is I went out and looked at his house as we were doing the Fox Nation special to see where the garbage goes. And while we were sitting there, we did a stand-up, I'm talking to the camera and everything else. I said, guys, let's just hang out for a few minutes. Sure enough, while we were doing it all, a woman came out of the student dorms where he lived and walked her garbage to the dumpster. So they didn't have garbage pickup. All the garbage went into the dumpster outside Kohberger in his complex. So if you had him as a possible, I would have just taken a young-looking detective and put him in a van and said, sit here and watch this guy. And when he throws his garbage out, keep your eyes on it. You have no expectation of privacy. It's discarded. And go take his garbage. Remember, you're sitting on the DNA at this point. You already got DNA from the scene, and you would have got him. The timeline must have prevented that for some reason. They must have been looking at him strongly enough to do what I just said, because you never would have let him leave town. Why? Because when he leaves town, they did the 2 car stops. Now, the story goes that that's an accident. This is the one thing I'm calling BS on. I think what happened is the task force had a disagreement. The story goes the FBI was already following him. That's how I know he was already developed as a suspect. The story goes the Bureau was following his car and lost him. So I don't understand, if you had him to that degree, why they didn't pull DNA from his garbage, because I would have even done following. I would have done a sneak and peek on his car. I would have got a search warrant on his car. You can get into any car. I don't care what it is. The tech guys, the NYPD autocrime guys can get into any car, so I'm sure they could have done it. You get into the car. He hadn't, I don't believe at that point, had really scrubbed out the interior of the car. You likely, with luminol and all of that, would have got blood samples that go to the room, to the girls, to the victims. So they didn't do that. He gets to leave town. He's got his dad with him. He gets 2 car stops. I think there was a disagreement in the task force. They had lost him. They said, I know a guy, pull him over. Somebody knows somebody. Where's he going? He's in Illinois. We think, all right, put out an all points on the car. I know a guy in that area, because it's 2 different jurisdictions that stopped him as he was driving cross country. And notice, neither one gave a summons. And both of them come in and just, the body cams are almost identical. Both of them come in and are scanning him. And I think that they was just trying to see who's in the car with him. They probably were afraid, if they didn't know it was the father, they were probably afraid, does he have another potential victim? He has a girlfriend that he's going to kill? But also, I think they were trying to see at this point, are there cuts on his hands that we could see that maybe can give us probable cause he's leaving town? What I would have been worried about is, after those 2 car stops, he's really raised up. And if you're Bryan Kohberger, you got to say, I think they're on to me. Dad, we're going to go right to O'Hare Airport. I'll see you when I see you. I'm buying a one-way ticket to Brazil, someplace that doesn't have extradition. Luckily, that didn't happen. But it goes to the idea that I think right there was some squishiness in this thing, and it could have gone really bad. When he gets back and they're trying to do the surveillance on him, now they know where he is. He's in Pennsylvania. He's in pocket again. Okay. It's a tough surveil. It's a gated community. Those are tough things to surveil. Like, people are going to know if in over there there's a black van parked out in front of the house. They're going to know, especially him, because he was paranoid. They observed him putting his garbage, in the neighbor's garbage cans, because he had a feeling he was under the radar, and he was walking around with rubber gloves on. So, there's various things you can do. You take over a neighbor. If I had a guess, they probably took over a neighbor's house across the street and said, hey, hi, we're the FBI. This is what we got. We need to set up a camera. I'm sorry, but it's an imposition. Can we take over your front room for a couple of days? You can also put up cameras, all kinds of things you could do. But they were observing him. And ultimately, they grabbed that garbage. But that, to your question, that's the surveillance that was going on. But according to some of the reporting, they already had him as a possible, and he left town. And that's bad, because he cleaned out the interior of the car back in Pennsylvania. And when they did the car for evidence, reportedly, they didn't get anything. And one of the things they observed when they were surveilling him in Pennsylvania is that he bleached out the interior of the car.
What are some of the complexities that arise between different agencies on a cross-country investigation such as this one? Because now you're describing, we know that Moscow PD brought in Idaho State Police and the FBI, and then now FBI is in Pennsylvania, and then it's Washington State also. Talk to us about what that looked like here.
The good news is that law enforcement, like in instances like this, will almost always cooperate. And I always go to the example that pings in my mind in terms of the most obscure. Is one time in the middle of the night, I needed somebody to look at a house in rural Oklahoma. And I had to Google it and find out. And I found this sheriff's office in the middle of the Great Plains. And I called up and I had to explain to the guy who I was. And I remember I faxed him. That's how far back we're going. If I remember, I faxed him my ID because he wanted to know it was a legit call. And here's the sheriff in the middle of the night. You should have heard the accent on this guy. And he drives out in the middle of the night.
He's probably saying the same thing about you.
He probably was. But middle of the night, this sweetheart of a cop, I get the desk. I get the desk sergeant. I'm explaining. He sent the patrol car out to photograph a house and show me I was trying to get the plate of the car that was in the driveway or something. I forget what it was. My guys brought me some crazy McGilla. We were working on it. But the point is, he was nothing but helpful. And that's kind of the ethic in law enforcement, and, that's generally what you get. And I think you certainly got it here because, as you're saying, the Wazoo cops came through big. Those two guys, again, unsung heroes here. I think the two car stops, again, were maybe the task force fraying on the edge a little bit. There might have been a disagreement about what they should do. There might have been a thing, if I had to guess, just based on experience. The FBI was supposed to be surveilling the car. They assured them that they had the car in pocket, and then they lost the car. I'm going off of reporting. Nobody ever told me that, but there's public reporting. I won't say the publication, but it's a legit publication that has that storyline. I think it's in the book that was published. So, I would think that what happened internally, there might have been a little disagreement where the state cops or even Moscow said, "What? You lost them? We are going to put out an alert on that car," and they probably called some friendlies and said, "Look for that car." Like I said, the fact that both of them did a similar car stop, no summonses were given, they both used the same excuse, unsafe lane change or some nonsense. That tells me that there might have been a little wiggle room there because the Bureau FBI put out a statement saying we had nothing to do with those car stops. So I think that might have been the one place right there where it feels to me like the whole thing might have frayed a little bit. But other than that, everybody did the right thing. The Bureau did great technical work. When it comes to this kind of stuff, nobody can match the FBI. We had tradecraft in NYPD that we developed that was unique at the time that now is commonplace. But in terms of nationwide, even internationally, you go to the Bureau if you're Moscow PD or even Idaho State PD. You go to the Bureau for this highly technical stuff, and it looks like, and then Pennsylvania State PD came through on the house. They had cops there. You need locals. Because no matter where you are, you always need a local partner because you can't just set up on the house. Somebody could call it in. Somebody could call 911 and say, "There's a strange car parked in front of my house. It's been here for 3 days." Now the whole thing's blown because the cops come. So you got to make sure everybody is on the same page, and everybody did the right thing. But I will say this: there's complication potentially for trial because it's a state case in Idaho. The way the law works is that you only have to turn over as what's called Brady material, stuff that has to be going into the case from the prosecution side, what is in your command and control as the prosecutor. And I had this in New York. The defendant's lawyer was making all kinds of noise. I want everything the FBI has. And the FBI did this. It was a kind of a joint case but not totally. It wasn't a joint case on paper. The FBI had the guy as a subject. We ended up with him as a subject. They weren't on it anymore. And so now we had it. The point is, this defense attorney wanted everything. And the FBI was like, we're not in this case. It wasn't a joint case. We had it. Anything of ours is no longer pertinent. The point is this: for a state case, the Bureau hates giving up. The feds hate giving up sources and methods, and that's the genealogical thing. They did the genealogical DNA. The defense in this case, in the Kohberger case, was having a hell of a time getting the FBI to cough up what they did and how they did it. And that's one of my other theories as to why we might have gotten a plea deal, because they just said to themselves, the Bureau is really reticent here. Let's just put this guy away forever and safeguard the methods, the technology, because the defense attorney was a sharp woman, this woman Ann Taylor in Idaho, and she was plugging away very hard at that potential soft spot. I saw her doing it.
Well, there were 47 days between the murders and the arrest. During that time, the case was heavily covered by media outlets across the country, but the public didn't have a lot of info about where things stood with the investigation. Was this a deliberate strategy on the end of law enforcement? And if so, how do you sort of balance transparency with sensitivity of the victims' families and the integrity of the investigation itself and all of those things? How do you know when to deliver certain information to the public without letting the suspect know too much?
Yeah, it's tough. And you always are going to err on the side of giving less. And I know it makes the public crazy, but, we had a lot of cases where, and I got to tell you, to that point, the task force was really good at OPSEC, at operational security, until they weren't. When all the leaks started to occur right on the eve of trial. But before that, I have to say, I was very impressed how they kept everybody quiet. Nobody broke. Nobody was leaking. I'll be honest, case is over. I could talk to it. They wouldn't talk to me. And I was one of the few, maybe one of the only people that was commenting on the case in national media that was saying during the 7 weeks that you're talking about, between the murders and the solve, saying, give them time. This stuff takes a long time, because I knew they're going to have to do the genealogical DNA. I knew they were going to have to do all of these search warrants and subpoenas and dump the cell towers. You get a ton of information. All of a sudden, you're sitting on a terabyte of information. The answer's in there. You got to find it. It's much like the Gilgo case. When they finally got going on it recently, not 10 years ago, but more recently, it took them about the same time, about 6 weeks, and then they got there. It was because they were crunching data. So my point is, they wouldn't even talk to me, and I had stuck my neck out saying, give them time, give them time. I think they're going to get there. So, that said, you are going to err on the side of caution, because you don't want things out in the media that you're going to potentially use as confirmatory when and if you get a suspect. Because if everybody knows that you're looking for somebody with bushy eyebrows, you want to make sure that, first of all, you don't get every nut in the world telling you, I know a guy with bushy eyebrows, so you got that. But you want to be able to use stuff that the public doesn't know about to confirm when somebody comes forward, let's say with a tip. They got thousands of tips. Let's say when the Washington State cops, the Wazoo cops that you're talking about, come forward and say, we got a possible here. Well, that is the Moscow task force, knows we're looking for a guy with bushy eyebrows. The public doesn't know that. And when Wazoo comes in and says, we got a possible, this guy Bryan Kohberger, here's what he looks like, and you see bushy eyebrows, now you're like, ooh, this is a real possibility. So you want to be able to have stuff so that if somebody comes forward and says, let's say they had an information about a tattoo, right? They didn't hear, but let's say, the guy's got an anchor tattoo that we're looking at. And just completely unbeknownst, somebody from the public says, hey, I know a guy that could be somebody you could be looking at because he's a really creepy guy. Well, describe him to me, ma'am. Well, he has this big anchor tattoo. Now boom, that might be my guy. So you hold back information so that if it develops later during the case and people are calling things in or other cops are bringing things in, it's confirmatory. So there's that. The other thing is you don't want, like I said, all kinds of nuts calling in leads, but and people do, God bless them. They got thousands of leads. At one point, they were getting like 1,000 leads a day, I was told, something crazy like that. God bless them. But also, you don't want the potential perp to take, the actual perp, I should say, to take prophylactic measures to get rid of evidence. Like, oh my God, they're looking for somebody, with bushy eyebrows. I'm going to throw my computer in the river because I don't want them to see I was searching for another knife. And you also don't want to give characters like me a lead to go poking around. I don't know, I'm on the journalism side of things. Now, to be honest, I did none of that. I wanted to make sure I got nowhere near the case because, God forbid, I did anything to damage the case's integrity. It would be terrible for my reputation, for the reputation of, obviously, for Fox, but also I would just feel terrible, But not everybody thinks that way. And you don't want pieces of information that go out, and then all of a sudden there was so much interest in this case, 200 journalists descend on every possibility, and it can really screw things up. So I know it's frustrating for the public. But having been on both sides of this, I have to defer to law enforcement. You really got to balance that. You can give what you can, but sometimes you just got to say no comment. We obviously can't release that. And, I get it. I was frustrated too. I was hoping that maybe I could get some stuff that was reportable, safely reportable. But instead I had to try to rely on instinct. It's just an intuition and, some experience to try to say, I think this is what they're doing. And, ultimately it ended up, being validated.
It's hard when you're in the thick of it, but that hardness pales in comparison to the triumph of a successful identification and arrest. And,
Sure.
We've covered so many cases where leaks have seriously damaged the investigation, and then you think about subsequent murders that are preventable. Dianne Feinstein, who leaked the shoe size and type of print of the Night Stalker,
Wow.
who then threw his shoes over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge.
Did that happen? Is
and
that right?
then, yep, and then he kept killing. But if
Wow.
so there's always been a tension with, the public's want to know, but with the priority of the victims and the investigation, so
Right.
that it can save lives and bring to justice those who have already been murdered.
Well, it happened here, actually, ultimately, because, as I said, they were great until they weren't. Somebody, apparently on the law enforcement side, if I'm reading the judge's body language accurately, but like a week before trial, 2 weeks before trial was scheduled to start, we had all of this stuff come out on Dateline, and this big leak that came out. And the judge said to both sides, but very clearly talking to the defense, do you want me to appoint a special prosecutor? And that creates a whole, after almost 3 years, we're all waiting around for the case. And now you have this whole collateral issue where you might have a separate investigation that gives the defense a place to drive a truck through. The defense was asking for more time. The judge, without saying it, actually gave them an extra week. But, if I was the defense, I would have said, Your Honor, well, they did ask for a continuance, but it creates an appealable issue because you could have said, you know what, I had to go to trial before I saw the various crime specials that were coming out, because the Amazon one wasn't out yet. And I would have said, I also don't have the excised footage. If you remember in Karen Reed's case, the prosecutor there was putting in the case clips of Karen Reed. And because he knew she wasn't going to testify, so he was putting clips of her from the various specials that she did, but they were clips rather that had been cut out that didn't make it into the documentaries. They were on the cutting room floor. And that was a big part of his case because it was stuff she said off camera that she thought wasn't going to see the air. And I would have been saying the same thing if I was where the defense attorney was, Ann Taylor. I would have said, I want everything, including the stuff you cut. And I need like a couple of weeks at the least to go through it all because, what if you had in there, in the leaked stuff and the stuff that fell on the cutting room floor, stuff like the prosecution or even the defense witnesses. And apparently there was some stuff that was a little contradictory. The roommate saying stuff that I don't really remember and things like that, which somewhat contradicted with, from what I understand, was going to go into the case. It just creates a mess. And like I said, that is the damage that leaks do. And I don't think he was going to get off. They had him as a slam dunk. But that said, if you had the one weak juror who was willing to go, who knows?
Is there anything that stood out to you, Paul, within this investigation that was especially innovative or unprecedented?
I think the genealogical DNA investigation, this is the first time I think it's finally hit the public radar screen. I mean, I know it's been used in other cases, Green River, as you've mentioned to me in the past. And then what actually was a well-known case was a case in Texas where the detective work was faulty, and using genealogical DNA, they got the wrong guy on a rape charge. And ultimately, they had a DP that declined prosecution, and that became like a little bit of a cause celeb on how you can't rely exclusively on genealogical DNA. But in this case, I think it's the first time the public has heard about that methodology. They've never heard of it. And if it's done right, it is very important, and it's going to become part of cases going forward, undeniably, because this was just touch DNA. It's just a little bit of DNA that somehow or other he left on the button of the clasp of the sheath of the knife. That is pretty deep. And they got it. And that's why I said, there's an unsung hero in there as well, because whoever processed that crime scene did a hell of a job.
Now, despite all of this solid evidence, this is sort of a hallmark of the times we live in now, where there's a faction of people, within the corners of the internet who remain skeptical about the case and Kohberger's involvement. I don't even understand one bit about that. But what do you say to them?
I say wise up, because there are cases that are what they appear to be. I've seen speculation regarding this that I think has a little bit more of a foundation to it, such as, did he have help? Which I don't believe, because obviously the investigation here was so fulsome that had he had somebody else in the car with him, or had he been in communication with somebody else, the way they did the phones and the cell towers and everything else, you'd have that second piece. And not only that, it's well established that he was a loner. And he seemed to have no contacts whatsoever, and he was some sort of an incel. I've seen speculation about his father's involvement. Just personally, I don't believe that either. I think the father drove cross-country with him just to have some father-son time, but also he probably knew his son was a little bit of an oddball. Drove cross country to make sure the son got back in, good shape, and keep an eye on him. And he might have even heard that the son was already having trouble in school and in his job there. Kohberger was crashing and burning in this program. He looked like he was about to be fired in his teaching assistant job, and the father might have known that. And so at the end of the day, your father's going to be there for you, but I don't believe the father had any involvement, and I think they would have surfaced evidence of that. And I also am pouring some water on the idea that this was not his first rodeo. You people say, how could he have started with 4 killings? Nobody does that. Well, no, that's not true. People do start with that. And if you look at the history of serial killers or mass murderers or whatever you want to call it, there are instances of that. And I also think that at the end of the day, he didn't expect to kill 4. I think he went in there, from my own personal opinion, he went in to do Maddie, God bless her. And Kaylee woke up. He didn't expect her to be sitting in the bed with Kaylee being there. Kaylee was back just for the weekend. Kaylee fought him. God bless her. Rest in peace as well. And that's why, he had to do her, because she was there. And then according to the leaked timeline, the police surmised that at some point Xana heard the noise, because she had just gotten a DoorDash delivery, so she was awake, came upstairs, and he chased her. And he managed to get a hold of her in the doorway of her bedroom. And whatever reason, Ethan didn't wake up. Apparently they'd been drinking. He must have been a solid sleeper. And at some point, he killed Ethan, and reportedly with 1 blow, but then, slashed at him, his legs. That's another detail that came out in the leaked information. That looks to be the timeline of what occurred and how it occurred. So I don't think there's any credence to any of those theories, and I do think that in this case, we do know what happened.
Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share, either about this case or about what the investigation means for the future of investigative work?
Future investigative work, all I would just say is the genealogical DNA is now very much a part of the methodology of all detective work. Everybody should just get used to it. It's going to be there. It's not a be-all and end-all. It has to very often be married to other police work, but it's going to be there. In terms of takeaways and final thoughts, all I can say is the following. You get a tragedy like this, the best thing to do is to try to figure out how to learn from it. And I can tell you that I told all of my relatives and everybody I knew who had young people away at college, get those Ring cameras, lock your doors. Everybody has a key. Stop being naive. I know you're young, you want to party. You got to be defensive, and I'm just going to say it may be politically incorrect, but especially young women. Young women are more often the targets of these things than not. And if you're a young woman or away from college, doesn't mean you can't have fun, but be very, very careful who you associate with, who you bring home, what you put on social media. This is the world that we live in. He almost certainly was watching them on social media, if I had to guess. And don't make it easy for these guys. And you know what? If you become a tough target, very often they'll move on to somebody else.